The paper I'm giving today is as much about images of the Well of Moses as about the Well of Moses itself. In offering a critique of these images and the impact they've had on our study of the well, I also acknowledge that all images are manipulated, and including, of course, the ones I'm going to use in this paper. Before I begin, I should point out that the statements I will be making about the original appearance of this object, and quite forcefully, its audience and its intention, depend on detailed arguments I've published elsewhere, and which were also discussed in Kalamazoo. The Great Cross of the Carthusian monastery of Champmol near Dijon, now known as the Well of Moses, is one of the most famous and canonical works of late medieval sculpture from Northern Europe. Made for Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, by a team of sculptors led by Claus Sluter over a 10-year period from 1395 to 1405. This work was a monumental undertaking of breathtaking technical skill. Its now trunculated form stood originally 14 metres high from the bottom of the large, deep well in which the hexagonal pier sat, to the tip of the now lost cross. Orientated so it rose above the point of the hexagon, the view seen here. On the faces of the pier were set 6 life-size figures of prophets carved in the round on undersized sockles. Between them, on the points of the hexagon, 6 angels, apparently set on impossibly thin columns with apparently impossibly thin wings, while above them on the terrace rose an extremely thin and tall column and cross, that alone was about 4 metres high, at the base of which knelt the Magdalene. The colour was extraordinarily richly polychromed, the whole was extraordinarily richly polychromed by the ducal painter Jean Manuel and his assistants, with extensive use of gold leaf, tin relief decoration, and ultramarine, traces of which remain. The colour used literally to glorify the monument, but also to convey a range of associations both ducal and Carthusian. As such, it was as much a painted object as a sculpted one, its colour being an integral and carefully considered part of the whole. Its patron, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, built Champmol as his burial place and had hoped to retire there as a Carthusian brother. He died before this became possible, but his presence in stone in this enclosed Carthusian space was nonetheless assured by his representation on the monument in the guise of Jeremiah, paired with a king, David, at the primary viewing angle, directly below the front of the cross, and so clearly in the most important viewpoint. Despite its splendour, and the representation of the Duke, the Great Cross was never intended as a work for a secular courtly audience, even if it must have been shown to such visitors on occasion. Its primary viewers were the Carthusian monks who lived in the cells in the cloister surrounding the monument and whose duty it was to pray for the soul of the Duke. This was a monument that was inaccessible and intended to be so, designed for a very limited and very particular audience, and every aspect of its imagery, form and colour reflects that purpose. Today, however, I want to consider not the making or meaning of this remarkable object, but instead to trace its reception over the 4 centuries subsequent to its production, through its visual and physical history, through its copies and reproduction in 3-dimensional graphic and photographic form. Such biographies for sculpture are intriguing, I think, and potentially rich, since there are so many possibilities and therefore implications in relation to how a work is reproduced, whether in terms of processes or in terms of viewpoints and angle. And the consequence of those choices are therefore more exaggerated than in the case of flat art. Considering the Well of Moses in this way is particularly fruitful for several reasons. Firstly, its relative inaccessibility meant it was known to many people only through its photographs and casts, making these reproductions overtly influential and paradigmatic. Secondly, the complexity of its hexagonal form presented 6 possible front views at least, and 12 if you consider the points of the hexagon as potential primary views. And the frontal view of a sculpture was very important from the late 19th century onwards, when Henriette Wolfram was to write about its, the idea of it as being the key viewpoint from which to see a sculpture. Thirdly, the Well of Moses was and is a canonical work, claimed as a harbinger of the Renaissance and a key weapon in the battle to claim the origins of that Renaissance for France, which meant there was something very important at stake in how it was presented and how it was reproduced. With the Well of Moses, the history of its reception and reproduction can be described as a series of losses that alienated the object contextually, but unlike many sculptured monuments, it was not removed from its original location, despite many attempts throughout the course of the 19th, 20th, and even into the 21st century to relocate it to a more accessible place. It's now, as many of you know, stood in the grounds of a psychiatric hospital. It's remarkable that the current mayor of Dijon still wants to move it to the museum, but it's a move that's staunchly opposed, you'll be pleased to hear, by the museum director. Instead, the physical environment around the well changed in significant ways, disrupting its visibility and integrity, changing its audience and obscuring its meaning. This history begins in 1407, just 2 years after the completion of the monument. On the order of John the Fearless, Philip's son, a large waterproof tent was erected around the cross, built around a wooden frame made with 256 awns of cloth, nailed to the structure with 12,700 nails. The canvas oil so it would, and I quote from the archives, resist the wind and the rain, and so protect the painting of the said cross and its pillar. The image, of course, is not of a tent, which is long since gone, but it's to try and give you some sense of the sort of scale that that tent would have had to have had. The accounts specify that this tent enveloped it, that is the cross, all around, and presumably completely obscured any view of it from the cloister, negating its role as a constantly visible reminder to the monks of both the passion of Christ and the generosity of their founder. While the loss here was one of visibility from a distance, it was done with the intention of retaining the visual integrity of the monument by preserving its vital and precious colour. However, never again in its history was the cross or its base to be visible for any length of time, and I'm presuming when they rebuilt the tent for the more durable structure, it would have briefly been visible, but for no period of any length of time was it visible from a distance. Now, the more durable wooden structure was replaced the tent in 1412, so the tent didn't last long, and in turn that structure or its successors were replaced in 1638 by the brick and stone aedicule that you see today. Covered by its tent, the cross must have been, in the 15th century, slowly ignored, or at least less avidly adored, since indulgences to encourage the inmates of the monastery to pray to the monument were granted at the request of the Dukes of Burgundy in 1418, 1432, and 1453. It was in their interest that such an important image made by their father and grandfather was actively engaged with by the Carthusians. The inaccessibility and indeed even invisibility of the monument in the subsequent centuries meant that it was relatively little known, I would argue, and I think the idea that it was a very influential sculpture actually in the 15th century is probably a false one, and I think the sort of traces we see of it in 15th century art may come from other places, other sculptures, lost sculptures or copies. Now, so I would argue it was relatively little known, but in the early 16th century a copy was made in as near stone and to scale with the Champmol work. But it was a very local copy. It was commissioned to stand just over a kilometre from the original work in the grounds of the cemetery of the Hôpital Saint-Esprit in Dijon by the then master of the order, Guillaume Sacanier. Although this copy, which has also subsequently lost its original cross, was faithful in many respects to the original, there were several key elements that were not reproduced, which stripped it of much of its original meaning, because they were either not relevant, desired, or perhaps simply too difficult or too expensive to reproduce. There was, to start with, of course, no well. The work was never polychromed as far as we can tell, and the Burgundian associations have been deliberately suppressed. As you can see from these details, the prophets on the cross were fairly faithfully copied, except one, Jeremiah, whose face has been altered. This suggests that in 1508 the meaning of this figure on the original was still understood, and the presence of a portrait of Philip on a monument made in an area no longer under Burgundian rule and for another quite unrelated patron was not desirable. I think we need to ask more about why he did copy this cross at all. However, through this copy, the form of the Great Cross was visible for the first time to a wider audience, but those viewing this copy would have lost a great deal of the original effect and meaning. The first stage in the process of suppressing the colour of the original monument had begun. For the rest of the pre-revolutionary period, the Great Cross seems to have left no surviving trace. Those who visited the Chartreuse and described or drew the ducal tombs, like Bilkin and Milan, ignored the well, which is perhaps unsurprising given that it was inside a building inside the enclosed great cloister. There is indeed no image of it before its collapse at some point in the late 18th century. This seems to have happened due to natural causes, possibly the caving in of the roof of the building. The physical evidence reveals it fell forwards, down over the front of the pillar, past David and Jeremiah, knocking off the hands of an angel and parts of the scrolls of Moses, David and Jeremiah, and damaging the base below. The loss of the cross, however, may have protected the rest of the monument during the Revolution, and it is striking how completely ignored it is by those who described, removed, destroyed, stole and reconstructed the tombs from the church at that period. Indeed, the only passing comment we have on the work from the surveyors of the site, as they undertook an assessment for the transformation of the remains into the psychiatric hospital, is to dub it a Gothic curiosity. With the loss of the cross and the figures on the terrace below, the monument also lost its original name and its key identifying feature. It is at this point that the term Well of Moses is first used to describe the work, chosen perhaps because of the perceived power of this figure, or because of Moses' iconographic associations with wells. Its result, however, was to draw attention to one of the prophets in a way that was never the original intention. By the 1830s, a new phase in the reception of the monument began, as the then director of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Dijon, Févre de Saint-Mamin, undertook the work of describing, assessing, reconstructing and restoring the monument. He also undertook excavations for the fragments of the cross and its missing figures in the well, finding in total 13 different elements, some of multiple pieces, most of which related to the cross, and all of which have since disappeared, with the exception of the crossed arms he presumed to be of the Virgin and the legs of the figure of Christ. Since the fragments themselves were not sufficient to attempt the full-scale reconstruction on the actual terrace he had hoped to achieve, he commissioned a three-dimensional model in small scale based on the fragments in the well. Févre de Saint-Mamin and all subsequent scholars made the not unreasonable assumption that there were three figures on the terrace, the Virgin, John and the Magdalene. And he interpreted the fragments he found, despite only having one small hand, a shoulder and the arms he thought were those of the Virgin, as coming from three figures, an assumption that was to dictate subsequent reconstructions, such as those by Liebrecht and Trocher in the 1930s. Saint-Mamin's model has been manipulated since its creation in various ways to reflect developing ideas and evidence about the well. Originally made for the director's private collection, it was donated to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in the 1880s, and in the 1940s it was used by Pierre Courtauld, the then director of the museum, to recreate the polychromy of the well as it re-emerged during the restoration, undertaken in those years by Hamelin and André. Displayed then, as you see here, with the crossover Moses and in a deep basin, it remained little known until its display in Cleveland in 2004 as part of the major exhibition on the art of the court of Burgundy, to evoke the monument for visitors. There, it no longer had its base, and the figures in the cross were rearranged to try and correct the position of John on the proper right side of the cross, dictated, I think, by his odd gesture that came from the need to reconstruct the small hand St. Mamin found in the well, in reality from one of the angels, into this figure. And you can see there that I think St. Mamin himself was actually unsure which figure this might have come from, and he kind of tries it out on both of them, John and the Magdalene. I should point out that the colour, however, that you see on this monument today is not, unfortunately, that of Pierre Courtault's reconstruction, but a more recent unsuccessful restoration, which has made the monument undisplayable. And this is the only way I could see it in the museum. It currently resides in the bowels of the museum, and I think it's important to consider that this is one of the few sort of colour reproductions of the well, even if it's really badly done. The visual historiography of the well remained emphatically monochromatic, and the first colour photograph published in the literature on the well, as far as I can ascertain, was not until 1990. Févre de Saint-Mamin was also responsible for supervising the making of casts of the well in the 1830s. These were not complete casts, but of the busts of the prophets alone. The first series for the Musée des Beaux-Arts made before 1839 recorded the unrestored state of the monument. The second series was made in the 1840s for the Musée Historique of Louis Philippe, and you can see them there behind Saint-Mamen's model arranged there. They were more substantial and interpretive, perhaps, in the way they were presented and the shapes chosen for them. These casts presented the work as a series of studies of individuals, or fragments neutralized and decontextualized by the uniform colour. They were originally white, some of them subsequently were painted. And their placement on pedestals, all of which fed into the possibility of laying claim to relationships between French art and medieval art, between French medieval art and the antique past, and that's why you have a Roman bust there, just for reference. And I think this is exactly the sort of comparison which was intended by the way that those casts actually were cut and chosen to be molded in that precise way and on those pedestals. So this also meant that they could lay claim to the French medieval art as being an important part in the development of the Renaissance in Europe. These casts are reflected in the way the monument was valued and viewed at this point. And they were in turn to be influential on how the work was reproduced and analysed for a very long time to come. Oh, I couldn't resist showing you this from Louis Courtault's discussion of the role of the Renaissance, the role of France in the Renaissance, where he's reproduced and even more restricted bust. I think this probably was one of the ones from the pre-1839 series, but I can't be certain, really to focus entirely on the face. And as I say, I think this type of effect has a very long influence, and there you see an image from Moran's book of 1991, where she focuses very intensively throughout on images of details of the faces, and the psychology of the prophets and the world become what is important, rather than the whole object itself. And of course, it's exactly that sort of comparison that's used both in words and in images, and here particularly in images by Trocher, to argue about the relationship of Sluter to the works of the Renaissance and his place within it. The first cast of the entire well was made in 1881, one of the earliest to be created for the newly formed Musée de Sculpture Comparée in Paris. It was in this form that the monument could be studied, best as an ensemble, although it was still set at the rendezvous and was importantly completely white. Its material aspects deliberately whitewashed away, as we see here, with the recent installation of the cast that's in the museum in Copenhagen, and you see there a figure actually applying the whitewash. The one that's in Paris actually has been tinted slightly now to make it look, to give it a suggestion of colour, but originally it was very important these were white. And this is something that Courtauld defended strongly in his introduction to the catalogue of the Musée Comparé. In sculpture, he said, there is no distinction between the original and its copy. For art history, a plaster cast without any foreign interpretation has exactly the same scientific value as the original and merits to be examined with the same interest. And I think if we look at subsequent ways in which the well is reproduced, it seems that on the whole, this idea of it as a complete monument is rare, and reproductions of it tend to focus on the individual figures. And I think there was a good reason for this. It meant comparisons with Italian Renaissance sculpture were much easier to make, and you see there these images from Kleinklaus and Riebrich compared with Donatello figure, which is exactly the sort of comparisons they were making with words, if not always with images. And I think also they're easier to understand as individual objects when they're cut out in this manner. And indeed, this idea of cutting out the well and taking it absolutely away from its context continues for really quite some time. The image from Müller looks like it's kind of floating, almost like a TARDIS, whereas this image is very recent, Harbison's book on the Northern Renaissance, where it retains the cut-out view and the sense of no context around it. And very importantly, the pillar is suppressed entirely. This is something we see again and again and again in the images of the well. The pillar is not something that is thought important. And I think also we have to consider, when we look at the whole history of photography of this monument, that there was one view, particularly, that seemed to be privileged above many others, and not just because the same photograph was reproduced, but because every time they seemed to have the opportunity to photograph the well, they seemed to decide that this was the correct view. And it's this one. We see it reproduced in 1898 in an image from Monget's book on the Chartreuse de Champmol. And then again in 1905, in a cut-out view by Kleinklaus. And it goes on, Monge, Kleinklaus, Liebrich, and others. And again, we can carry on, we can see it here reproduced in an image from the Conway that Morand used in her 1990 book. And indeed, one of the early colour reproductions of the well chooses that view again to take. And I think this is important because what it gives us is a sort of paradigmatic view, a view that is canonical, and suggests that this is perhaps the correct way of viewing. It's interesting, actually, when I went through this, I expected to find Moses as the one that was most often reproduced, but I think even early in its history, the primacy of David was recognised visually. The other thing that is very difficult, I think, in the way it's been reproduced and has given a very false view is the fact that, of course, it has been photographed very often from head-on. And this was primarily because in the 19th century, you can see there a walkway was placed around the inside of the well, which meant that your viewing level, and those of you who were there back in the 1980s will remember this, is very high on the figures, and that you were actually at eye level with the figures. But I think it also reflected an idea of how one should reproduce sculpture at this time, as I say, with a head-on view, not seen from below. And it really does create a flattening out of the object, not just a decontextualizing of it, but a suggestion that it's much less three-dimensional than it actually is. And that this sort of head-on view continues even when they take down the walkway, and you could now actually photograph it from below. It is something that still remains as the kind of view, the expected view of the well. I just want to emphasize how different the actual view is when you're inside the newly built walkway, which is still, of course, too close to the object, but at least at the right level. And the pier, the importance of the pier on which the well is standing is very apparent. There is a kind of view that gives you a sense of where your eye line actually would be. I also want to emphasise that this was visually important because here, of course, were the arms of the Dukes of Burgundy, and all the elements, you can just see the traces of them there in that circle with the rays coming out. And all the elements that were important in the pier, and I think particularly the foliage, actually, which is very understudied, is completely different, and I'm certain has meaning, an important meaning for the figures that are represented above, is hardly ever mentioned, actually, in any studies on the well. The angels, of course, the sense of their unbelievable technical, the unbelievable technical skill of Sluter and his team in creating this sort of sense of incredibly thin wings, I think, gets lost. And the way that the different views that, of course, should be seen from below, we may be well aware of. But particularly, I think, I want to emphasise with these images the emphatic way in which the monument actually juts out from its space, from the space of the pier, which you lose entirely in those standard black and white photographs, and even the colour ones that we've been used to seeing. Of course, this doesn't mean we still have a proper view of the well. And to conclude, I want to say that today we have a monument that is more accessible than at any time in its history, and which has colour more visible than it for over 150 years. We're still, however, too close. When we enter the building and stand over the waters of the well, then was the original intention. New technologies will undoubtedly present us with the computer-generated three-dimensional images that allow us to see the well from a distance and recreate its fully gilded and coloured state. And we will continue to manipulate those images to make our arguments by their viewpoint selection and cropping, as indeed, as I say, I've done today. In the age of easily accessible and high-quality digital reproductions, it's important to emphasise that we must still look hard at the originals, the full impact and complex subtleties of which, most particularly in this case, remain difficult to capture in photographs. I finish with a remark by Ferenc Gerhardt in 1905 concerning his response to the well that remains true today. Everybody has seen a cast or photograph of this work, but in truth, even our best reproductions are still very imperfect, and never have I felt this so much as when I was in front of the Prophets of Sluter, on the fragile wooden balcony over the dormant waters of the well.